Absolute morality makes sense in a biblical worldview. What about laws of logic? Laws of logic are the correct standard of reasoning. Why would there be a standard of reasoning in a chance universe where everybody just has different kinds of thoughts? Who's to say whose is right and whose are wrong? Right? That's just, it doesn't make sense. But laws of logic make sense in a Christian worldview because they reflect God's thinking. We have a standard of correct thinking because we have the biblical God. God is our correct standard for everything. Why would there be uniformity in nature? Because God upholds the universe in a consistent, law-like fashion. He does that for our benefit, and He's promised us that there will be a certain degree of uniformity in the future, as there has been in the past. Now, my point here is not that evolutionists don't believe in these things, because they do. Evolutionists do believe in laws of logic, uniformity, and morality. But those things do not make sense in an evolutionary universe. So they're relying upon something that, on their own worldview, would have no rational foundation. It would have no good reason, no justification on their worldview. And so, because when you present this argument, a lot of times the evolutionists will say, well, wait a minute, I don't even believe the Bible, and I can use laws of logic. I say, I know, but the fact is, if your worldview were true, you shouldn't. You shouldn't be able to use laws of logic, because those don't make sense given your worldview. And so what we're going to do is an internal critique showing that he's relying upon principles that are actually contingent upon the biblical God. His worldview is inconsistent. It blows itself up. And just to illustrate this, on the surface it may seem like we have two competing worldviews. We've got the biblical worldview and the secular worldview. Take your pick. You like the Bible, you like naturalism. You like blue, you like flame color. But we're going to find when we examine these up close, when we open up the hood, as it were, the biblical worldview makes sense. It's going to go somewhere. It's going to lead to knowledge. The secular worldview, when we examine it, it's not going to rationally work. It's not going to go anywhere. It cannot lead to knowledge. And I want to give you some quick examples of this before we go in a little more depth. Relativism. Want me to disprove relativism here? It's not hard. Relativism is the belief that all things are relative. There are no absolutes. And you'll hear people who are relativists say things like, well, that's your truth, but it's not my truth, and so on and so forth, which is really just a dumb thing to say, isn't it? Because truth is truth, and it's not subjective. Truth is objective. But the relativist will say there are no absolutes. And of course, the question you want to ask is, are you absolutely certain? Yeah. You see, the statement, there are no absolutes, is an absolute statement. So if it's true, it's false. Therefore, it's false. Easy to refute relativism. What about empiricism? I mentioned to you earlier that many evolutionists are empiricists. They believe that all truth claims are answered by empirical observation, sometimes supplemented with the need for logical consistency. Now, I believe in empirical methods. I believe that some truth claims are answered empirically. I believe in the methods of science, but not all truth claims are answered empirically. You couldn't answer the question of life after death empirically. I take that on the authority of Scripture that there's life after death. But the empiricist says, oh no, if you can't see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, whatever, it's not real. It's not truth. And so you must eventually ask the empiricist, how do you know the statement itself is true? How do you know that all truth claims are proved by empirical observation? Did you prove that by empirical observation? No. You can't observe truth claims, right? That doesn't even make sense. You can't see a truth claim. It's abstract. And so the notion that all truth claims are proved by empirical observation cannot be proved by empirical observation, therefore ought to be rejected on its own standard. See, empiricism refutes itself, just like relativism. Secular worldviews blow themselves up. All you have to do is light the match and let it go. It will circle back around and destroy itself. It's always the case. By the way, the biblical worldview is the only worldview that won't do that. The biblical worldview is the only one that when you apply it to itself, it's self-consistent. It doesn't blow itself up. All secular worldviews do. And I want to give you another example to illustrate this. A debate over biblical creation is a lot like a debate on the existence of air. Can you imagine two people arguing whether or not air exists? What would the critic of air say? Can you imagine this person making this eloquent argument that air does not exist, all the while breathing air, and expecting that we can hear his arguments as they're transmitted through the air? That'd be kind of strange, wouldn't it? You see, the critic of air must use air in order to make a case against air. The fact that he's able to argue at all proves that he is wrong. Likewise, the critic of the Bible must use biblical presuppositions in order to argue against the Bible. The fact that he's able to make an argument at all proves that he's wrong. Because you see, the secularist is standing on Christian ground using God's laws of logic to try and argue against the Christian position. Now, that is not going to work, is it? His position is self-refuting. And so to illustrate this, I'd like to zoom in on a few of these preconditions of intelligibility: laws of logic, uniformity of nature, absolute morality. We'll probably have time to do 2 this morning. Let's start with absolute morality. I think this is the easiest to understand. It's a good one to start with if you're new to this way of apologetics. If God created us, He has the right to set the rules. Otherwise, why not make our own rules? Well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? In the Christian worldview, God is good and is the standard of goodness. But if it's just, if we're just rearranged pond scum, why not do what you want? And by the way, it has to be the biblical God, because it's the God who created us and who has revealed Himself to us in His Word. It's got to be the biblical God. It can't be some other, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. If Adam is in your past, if God made you, who owns you? God does. Who has the right to make the rules? God does. And so you end up with absolute morality. Absolutes from God. God sets the rules. If ape is in your past, if you're just rearranged pond scum, why not make your own rules, right? You own yourself, and you can determine your own rules. And so we end up with relative morality. Man sets his own rules. Now, some people might say that's right. Morality is relative. You can make up your own rules, and so can I, and therefore you can't go around telling other people what not to do. And the moment they say you can't tell other people what not to do, what are they doing? Telling other people what not to do. Okay, so relative morality is pretty well self-refuting just right there. It doesn't make sense. And nobody really believes in relative morality. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to ask an evolutionist or anyone who's rejected biblical authority, how do you decide right from wrong? Because apart from the biblical God, morality can only be relative, but people cannot live that way. And people know in their heart of hearts that morality is not relative. Now, some people will say, oh, come on, Dr. Lisle, everybody knows right from wrong. To which I would respond, yeah, that's because God has revealed Himself to human beings, and so in our conscience we know right from wrong. But my point is, in an evolutionary worldview, why would there be such a thing as right and wrong, and how could you possibly know about it? Say everybody knows is not answering the question. Now, I want to give you some possible responses to this. Not that there are any good responses, but that's the point. I want to show you that the best responses to this are not rational. Some people might say, oh, you don't need God to determine right and wrong, because morality is what brings the most happiness to the most people. That's a pretty common response from the atheist camp, though it's not universally their response. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, yeah, that's right. We ought to be concerned about the happiness of others. To which I would say, yes, in the Christian worldview. Right? That's the golden rule. We're to do unto others as we'd have them do unto us. So even here, he's borrowed on the Christian worldview a little bit to support his own. But my point is, in an evolutionary universe, why should I be concerned about the happiness of others? If they're just rearranged pond scum, why should I be concerned about their happiness? Right? Happiness is just a chemical reaction in the brain if you're an evolutionist, so why should I try to achieve that particular chemical reaction and not another, like, say, pain? Maybe what's good is what brings the most pain to the most people. Right? I mean, this is totally arbitrary and totally impractical, too. How could you possibly measure this? I mean, how do you know what brings the most happiness to the most people? Do we have little meters on our arm telling us how happy we are? Can I point my tricorder at you and say, oh, you're this 50 levels of happiness or whatever? That's not going to work. Marquis de Sade enjoyed torturing women. Now, maybe the pleasure he got in torturing women outweighed the pain of the women that he tortured. And so that would be good under this definition. And so you say, well, yeah, that's not going to work. That's not a tenable position. Well, the moral code is simply electrical impulses in the brain. I was debating a PhD neurologist, and this was his answer. And he was a very smart man. I couldn't believe that he gave this ridiculous answer. Because if it's just a section of your brain, if it's just electrical impulses in the brain, why should I follow it? Right? I have other impulses in my brain too. I don't follow all of my impulses, and that's probably a good thing, right? Because sometimes I'm inclined to do things that maybe are not good. This would not be morality if it's just impulses in the brain. It's not universal laws, and my brain's different than yours anyway. I have different impulses, and so what's good for me would be different than what's good for you. And you can't have objective morality that way. Laws of morality are conventions adopted for the benefit of society. There's something, we all agree to them, and so, because we need these laws to maintain society. Why? That's arbitrary. Well, because without that, we'd have disorder. So, it's an evolutionary universe. Well, but Dr. Lisle, we need these laws to prevent us from acting, what, like animals? Is that what you want to say? But in the evolutionary worldview, that's all we are, right? And by the way, if they're conventional, then different cultures could adopt different laws of morality, right? And so you could have different moral codes in different cultures. Now, there have been cultures, in a sense, that have tried this. Hitler thought that it would benefit his society to kill Jews, but I don't think that any of us would say that that is really good. You couldn't say that society is evil if this was the definition of morality, because every society would have its different moral code. So they're not laws if they're just conventions. And by the way, the word benefit assumes a standard of goodness anyway. Who's to say what's good unless you already have a standard of goodness? So it's a bit circular as well. People can adopt their own moral codes. I had one reporter tell me when he was a secular reporter and he was interviewing me, and I said, sure, but if you can, so can I, and you might not like some of the things that I want to do. Maybe I want to shoot you. He got the point. He got the point. He realized that you can't have